You don't feel trapped. That's why it works. The debt you're defending is the one limiting you, not the reckless one, the responsible one, the one everyone congratulated you for, the one you call smart. It didn't just take your money, it took your flexibility, it took your margin, it took your ability to move without consequences. And it did it slowly enough that you called it stability. Mortgages aren't sold as obligation, they're sold as progress. Student loans aren't sold as liability, they're sold as ambition. Car payments aren't sold as constraint, they're sold as independence. Different labels, same control. And once you sign, the structure doesn't care what changes in your life. It doesn't care if your income tightens. It doesn't care if your priorities shift. It doesn't care if you outgrow the decision. It only cares that you keep paying. You don't feel trapped. You feel responsible. And that's more powerful. You don't notice it when you sign. You notice it later. A couple in Denver buys their first home. They've been saving for 4 years. They finally have enough for the down payment. It feels earned. It feels stable, like they've moved forward. For a while, nothing feels wrong. Then the water heater breaks. Then property taxes go up. Then the roof needs work. None of it is dramatic. That's the point. It's just normal life. But normal life now has to fit inside a payment schedule that never moves. The mortgage doesn't shrink when expenses rise. It doesn't pause when income tightens. It just waits and extracts. They can afford it, barely. But barely leaves no margin. And margin is what absorbs disruption. Without margin, every inconvenience becomes pressure. The house still looks like ownership from the outside, but inside it feels like maintenance. Across the country, a recent graduate finishes school. She has a degree, she has a job, she has student loans. The payments start immediately. She makes enough to cover them. Rent, food, insurance, the basics. It all fits. But again, barely. So when something unexpected happens, there's no room. She doesn't collapse. She adjusts. She becomes careful. More careful than she used to be. The loans don't scream at her. They don't threaten her. They just sit there, due every month. And slowly her decisions start orbiting around them. Not because she's irresponsible, because she committed. At first, nothing breaks. The payments fit. The job is steady. The plan looks stable. Then life adjusts. Not dramatically, gradually. Groceries cost more. Insurance climbs. Rent rises. Utilities shift. Income barely moves. Nothing collapses. But the space between income and obligation narrows. That space is margin. And margin is what keeps you flexible. When margin disappears, decisions change. Quietly. You stop taking risks. You stop negotiating. You stop considering options that disrupt the payment schedule. Because disruption is expensive. The debt doesn't increase, but the cost of movement does. That's when the psychological shift begins. You start optimizing for stability instead of growth. The safer job looks smarter. The relocation feels reckless. The side business feels irresponsible. Not because they are, because your commitments don't allow volatility. Debt doesn't remove money first, it removes risk tolerance. And without risk tolerance, there's no leverage. Without leverage, there is no acceleration, just maintenance. Then something small happens. A repair, a medical bill, a delayed paycheck, individually manageable, together destabilizing. So you use credit, just temporarily. Temporary becomes carried balance. Carried balance becomes interest. Interest becomes drag. Drag becomes dependency. Now you're not just maintaining one commitment. You're maintaining layers, and every layer reduces maneuverability. You don't quit. You don't pause. You don't experiment. You comply. Not consciously, automatically. The debt becomes the quiet authority in the room. It doesn't speak. It just limits. And the longer it stays, the more permanent it feels. You stop asking whether it was worth it. You start defending it. Because admitting the constraint would mean confronting the commitment. So you call it responsibility. You call it maturity. You call it building a future. But the future feels smaller than it did before you signed. There's no crisis, no collapse, just fewer exits. And once leaving feels more dangerous than staying, the trap is closed. Here's what most people never calculate. Debt isn't expensive because of the rate. It's expensive because of the duration. A 30-year mortgage isn't a purchase. It's a 360-month commitment. 360 decisions already made. Before life happens. Interest is not just a fee. It's rent on your future flexibility. You are paying to use time that doesn't belong to you yet. And once time is pledged, behavior adjusts. That's the mechanism. Long commitments compress optionality. Optionality is the ability to move without penalty. When optionality shrinks, leverage shrinks. When leverage shrinks, growth slows. This isn't emotional. It's structural. A 30-year obligation does something subtle. It anchors your risk ceiling. Every decision now gets filtered through one question. Will this disrupt the payment schedule? If the answer is yes, it gets rejected. Not because it's bad, because it's volatile. Volatility becomes dangerous when cash flow is pre-allocated. So you eliminate volatility, you stabilize, you narrow. This is how commitment scales quietly. Debt turns future income into a fixed obligation. Fixed obligations require predictable income. Predictable income requires predictable behavior. Predictable behavior reduces variance. Reduced variance reduces upside. Now add time. 10 years into a long-term loan, something happens, not financially. Psychologically, the sunk cost effect strengthens attachment. I've already paid this much. So exiting feels irrational, even if the structure is restrictive. The longer the term, the stronger the attachment, and attachment reduces exit probability. Now layer in inflation. As living costs rise, fixed payments consume a larger relative share of emotional bandwidth. Even if income rises slightly, cognitive load increases. Your mind begins allocating energy toward protection instead of expansion. Protection is stabilizing. Expansion is compounding. Debt prioritizes protection. That's why it feels responsible. Responsibility becomes synonymous with containment. Containment becomes lifestyle. Lifestyle becomes identity. At that point, the debt no longer needs enforcement. It's internalized. You don't need reminders. You plan around it automatically. That's the deepest shift. The obligation moves from external to internal, and once internalized, it no longer feels optional. It feels permanent. Not because it is, because behavior has adjusted to accommodate it. That is commitment compression. Future freedom traded for present access. Optionality traded for ownership optics. Volatility traded for predictability. And predictability stabilizes systems. That's why long-term debt is powerful. Not because it destroys people, because it shapes them, gradually, until staying feels logical and leaving feels irrational. That's not moral failure, that's structural design. Debt doesn't make people collapse. It makes them cautious. Cautious people don't take large risks. They stabilize, they endure, they maintain. Maintenance feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels correct. But maintenance doesn't expand anything. It prevents loss. And preventing loss is not the same as building freedom. By the time most people realize that, the commitments are layered. The payments are normalized. The flexibility is gone. Leaving doesn't feel brave. It feels dangerous. So they stay. Not because they're weak, because the structure makes staying rational. Debt isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't demand attention. It just waits. And the longer it waits, the smaller your options become. You don't feel trapped. You feel responsible. Pause. The real cost isn't the debt. It's what you were trained to do with the money you don't borrow.